The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Marcus Williams pushed his cleaning cart through the marble lobby of Meridian Tower, his rubber-soled shoes making barely a whisper against the polished floor. At 42, he moved with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned to make himself invisible, his Navy janitor's uniform pressed and spotless despite the late hour. The building rose 30 floors above him, housing some of the city's most powerful executives. But Marcus knew his place was in the shadows, keeping their world clean while they slept. The elevator chimed softly as it descended, and Marcus straightened slightly, preparing for another encounter he had grown to dread. Derek Hayes stepped out, his expensive suit wrinkled from a long day of meetings, his tie loosened around his thick neck. The middle manager's eyes immediately found Marcus, and that familiar sneer spread across his pale features. Well, Marcus, Derek said, his voice dripping with condescension. Still scrubbing floors at your age. Must be nice having such low expectations for yourself. Derek adjusted his cufflinks, a gesture Marcus had noticed he made whenever he wanted to emphasize his superiority. Good evening, Mr. Hayes, Marcus replied evenly, his voice carrying no trace of anger despite the familiar sting of the words. He had learned long ago that dignity was something no one could take from him, regardless of what uniform he wore or what assumptions they made about his intelligence. Before we continue with Marcus's story tonight, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe workplace dynamics like this are all too common where you're from, and we'd love to hear about your experiences with respect in professional settings. Derek chuckled, a harsh sound that echoed off the marble walls. You know what I love about you people, he continued, his words carefully chosen to wound. Always so polite, so grateful just to have any job at all. Makes management so much easier when expectations are set appropriately low. He glanced at his expensive watch, another prop in his performance of superiority. Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his hands remained steady on the cart handle. Behind Derek's cruel words, he could hear the insecurity that drove them, the desperate need to elevate himself by diminishing others. It was a tune Marcus had heard countless times before in boardrooms and break rooms alike, though the context had changed dramatically. Marcus resumed his methodical cleaning as Derek finally disappeared into the parking garage, the manager's laughter still echoing in the empty lobby. The encounter left a familiar bitter taste, but Marcus had developed thick skin over the past 3 years of night shifts at Meridian Tower. He sprayed the glass doors with cleaner, his movements precise and economical, each motion honed by countless repetitions. The building settled around him as he worked, its daytime energy giving way to the peaceful quiet he had come to cherish. This was when Marcus felt most himself, when the suits and assumptions fell away and he could simply focus on the task at hand. His daughter Sophia would be sleeping soundly now in their small apartment across town, her homework completed and her school clothes laid out for morning. Everything he endured, every slight and sneer, was for her future. As he polished the brass elevator buttons, Marcus allowed his mind to wander to the morning routine that awaited him. Sophia would wake with her usual bright smile, chattering about her upcoming science project while he prepared her breakfast. She saw only a father who worked hard to provide for her, never suspecting the weight of his past or the dreams he had quietly buried. The security desk phone rang, breaking his concentration. Night shift again, Marcus called out Jim, the elderly guard who had always treated him with basic human decency. You ever think about doing something different with your life? Marcus paused in his cleaning, considering the question that haunted his quieter moments. Sometimes he replied honestly, but good work is good work, regardless of what others think about it. He meant those words. Even as part of him remembered boardrooms and quarterly reports, strategic planning sessions, and the thrill of solving complex business problems. The elevator chimed again, and Marcus glanced up to see a woman in an elegant charcoal suit stepping out. Victoria Chun moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command, her presence immediately transforming the atmosphere of the lobby. She nodded politely to Marcus as she passed, her eyes taking in his careful attention to detail with what seemed like genuine appreciation rather than dismissal. The following evening brought another encounter that would test Marcus's carefully maintained composure. He was restocking the supply closet on the 15th floor when Derek's voice boomed down the hallway, accompanied by the nervous laughter of two junior executives who seemed eager to please their superior. "Look what we have here," Derek announced as he spotted Marcus arranging cleaning supplies with methodical precision. "Our resident philosopher of floor maintenance. Tell me, Marcus, what profound insights have you gleaned from your extensive education in janitorial arts?" The two younger men shifted uncomfortably, sensing the cruelty beneath Derek's words, but lacking the courage to challenge a manager who held sway over their careers. Marcus continued his work without looking up, his movements steady despite the familiar heat rising in his chest. "You know what I admire about the working class," Derek continued, warming to his theme as he often did when he had an audience. "Such simple needs, such uncomplicated dreams. No stress about quarterly projections or market volatility. Just push that mop, collect that paycheck, and call a day." Marcus finally turned, his dark eyes meeting Derek's pale blue ones with quiet intensity. "Sometimes the most important work happens when no one is watching, Mr. Hayes," he said calmly. "The foundation has to be solid before you can build anything worthwhile on top of it." Derek's smile faltered slightly at the unexpected eloquence, but he recovered quickly. "Foundation," he repeated mockingly. Listen to him talk like he knows something about building anything more complicated than a house of cards. The junior executives laughed on cue, though their discomfort was increasingly obvious. Marcus returned to his supplies, but his mind was already calculating risk and reward, measuring the cost of silence against the price of speaking truth. Somewhere in his modest apartment, Sophia slept peacefully, trusting in his ability to provide for her tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow. For now, that trust demanded his continued invisibility, no matter how much Derek's ignorance burned. 3 days later, Marcus arrived at work to find Derek waiting in the lobby with a smug expression that immediately set alarm bells ringing. The manager was flanked by 2 security guards and held a clipboard in his manicured hands, tapping it rhythmically against his thigh like a conductor preparing for an unpleasant symphony. "We need to have a conversation about your performance, Marcus," Derek announced loudly enough for his voice to carry across the marble expanse. Several late-working employees paused to watch the spectacle, their curiosity piqued by the unusual gathering in the normally serene lobby. Marcus set down his cleaning supplies and faced Derek directly, his posture straight despite the knot forming in his stomach. "What seems to be the problem, Mr. Hayes?" he asked, keeping his voice level even as he mentally cataloged every interaction they had shared over the past week. Derek consulted his clipboard with theatrical precision. "Multiple complaints about your attitude, substandard work quality, and inappropriate behavior toward management staff." He looked up with mock concern. "I'm afraid we're going to have to place you on probation while we investigate these serious allegations." The watching employees exchanged glances, some looking uncomfortable with the public nature of Derek's accusations. Marcus felt the familiar burn of injustice, but also something deeper and more dangerous. His hands clenched briefly at his sides before he forced them to relax, thinking of Sophia's trusting face and the bills that depended on his continued employment. "I'd like to know the specifics of these complaints," Marcus replied quietly, "and I'd prefer to discuss this matter privately, as is standard protocol for personnel issues." Derek's smile widened. "Oh, I think transparency is important here. We want everyone to understand that certain standards of respect and competence are expected, regardless of background or previous circumstances." His emphasis on the last words carried a weight that made Marcus's blood run cold. The fabricated complaints hung in the air like poison as Derek savored his moment of power. Marcus could feel the eyes of the gathered employees boring into him, some sympathetic, others merely curious about the drama unfolding before them. His mind raced through his options, each one fraught with risk he could not afford to take. Specifically, Derek continued, consulting his clipboard again, There have been reports of you acting above your station, offering unsolicited opinions on matters beyond your comprehension, and showing disrespect for the natural hierarchy of this organization. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. Those weren't random accusations. Derek had been watching, listening, waiting for any excuse to strike. The comment about foundations, the polite responses that demonstrated education Derek couldn't tolerate in someone he considered beneath him. Every word had been weaponized. From the corner of his eye, Marcus noticed Victoria Chun emerging from the elevator bank, her stride purposeful as she approached the gathering. Her presence shifted the energy in the room immediately, though Derek seemed oblivious to her arrival, too intoxicated by his own performance to notice. Furthermore, Derek announced, his voice rising with theatrical indignation, "There have been concerns about your ability to follow simple instructions and maintain appropriate boundaries with your betters. These are serious character defects that reflect poorly on our entire organization." Victoria Chun stopped just outside the circle of onlookers, her intelligent eyes taking in the scene with the sharp assessment of someone accustomed to reading corporate dynamics. Marcus caught her gaze for just a moment and saw something there that gave him pause. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. "Mr. Hayes," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying across the lobby with surprising authority. "I believe there may be some misunderstanding about my qualifications and background. Perhaps we should discuss this in your office where we can review my actual performance record rather than relying on anonymous complaints." Derek's face flushed red at Marcus's suggestion, the implication that his accusations might be unfounded striking at his carefully constructed authority. "Performance record," he repeated with a harsh laugh. "What performance record could someone like you possibly have that would interest me?" The crowd of onlookers had grown larger, drawn by the escalating tension and Derek's increasingly unprofessional behavior. Marcus remained calm, but something fundamental was shifting inside him. 3 years of swallowed pride and careful silence were beginning to crack under the weight of Derek's malicious ignorance. "Someone like me," Marcus repeated slowly, his voice carrying a new edge that made several employees lean forward. "And what exactly do you mean by that, Mr. Hayes?" Derek stepped closer, emboldened by what he perceived as Marcus's weakness. "You know exactly what I mean. People from your background, with your limited education and opportunities. You should be grateful for any job, not questioning the decisions of your superiors." Victoria Chun moved closer to the circle, her expression unreadable, but her attention completely focused on the unfolding confrontation. Marcus noticed her subtle shift in position, placing herself where she could hear every word clearly. The security guards looked increasingly uncomfortable as Derek's language became more pointed, his thinly veiled prejudices bleeding through his corporate speak. One of them, an older man Marcus had always respected, gave him an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. Marcus felt the weight of his daughter's future pressing down on him, the careful balance he had maintained for years trembling on the edge of collapse. Every instinct told him to retreat, to apologize, to preserve the fragile security they had built together. But Derek's words had crossed a line that went beyond professional courtesy into something far more personal and dangerous. "Actually, Mr. Hayes," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying across the marble lobby with startling clarity, "I think you might be surprised by what my background actually includes." Derek's eyes narrowed at Marcus's unexpected confidence, sensing a shift in the dynamic he had worked so hard to control. The manager stepped even closer, his voice dropping to what he imagined was a threatening whisper, but carried clearly across the silent lobby. "Are you threatening me, Marcus?" Derek hissed. "Because I want to make sure everyone here understands what happens to people who forget their place in this organization." He gestured broadly at the assembled crowd, playing to his audience like a politician at a rally. Marcus stood his ground, his posture straightening as years of careful submission began to fall away like shed skin. The familiar weight of his father's advice echoed in his mind. "Son, dignity isn't something they can take from you, only something you can give away." Tonight, he decided the giving would stop. I'm not threatening anyone, Mr. Hayes, Marcus replied, his voice growing stronger with each word. I'm simply suggesting that your assumptions about my qualifications might be based on incomplete information. Victoria Chun had moved close enough now to hear every nuance of the conversation, her sharp business instincts clearly engaged as she watched the drama unfold. Several other late working executives had emerged from the elevator banks, drawn by the commotion and Derek's raised voice. Derek laughed again, but there was something forced about it now, a brittle quality that suggested his confidence was beginning to crack. Incomplete information, he repeated mockingly. What could you possibly tell me that would change anything about this situation? Marcus glanced around the assembled crowd, his gaze lingering for a moment on Victoria Chen's attentive face before returning to Derek's flushed features. 3 years of silence stretched between them like a drawn bowstring, ready to release everything he had kept carefully hidden. Well, Mr. Hayes, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of suppressed truth, you might be interested to know that before I started working nights here, I spent 12 years as a senior executive at Morrison Industries. The lobby fell silent as Marcus's words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Derek's smug expression flickered, confusion replacing certainty as he processed what he had just heard. Morrison Industries was a Fortune 500 company, a name that commanded respect in corporate circles across the country. You're lying, Derek said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. His eyes darted around the assembled crowd, seeking support that was no longer forthcoming. The watching executives had shifted their attention from amusement to genuine interest, recognizing the weight of Marcus's claim. Marcus reached into his back pocket and withdrew his wallet, extracting a worn business card that he had kept for 3 years like a talisman. He held it up for Derek to see, the elegant typography still clearly visible despite its age. Marcus Williams, Senior Vice President of Strategic Development, Morrison Industries. Derek snatched the card from Marcus's hand, studying it with the desperate intensity of a man watching his worldview crumble. The paper was genuine, the embossing authentic, the corporate logo unmistakable. His face went through a spectrum of colors, from red to pale to an unhealthy greenish hue. Victoria Chun stepped forward from the crowd, her movement deliberate and commanding. She extended her hand toward Derek. "May I see that, please," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Derek handed over the card with trembling fingers, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. Victoria examined it carefully, her expression neutral, but her eyes sharp with recognition and calculation. "Marcus Williams," she said slowly, looking up to meet his gaze directly. "I remember reading about your departure from Morrison. The Hendricks embezzlement scandal. You were cleared of all charges, but chose to resign rather than weather the media storm that followed." "That's correct," Marcus replied quietly. "I had a young daughter to protect. Sometimes reputation matters less than doing what's right for your family." Derek stood frozen, the business card still trembling in Victoria's steady hands as the full implications of his behavior crashed down upon him. The assembled crowd had grown completely silent, witnessing the spectacular collapse of a bully's carefully constructed authority. "But that's impossible," Derek stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're just a janitor. You clean floors. You empty trash cans." His worldview was fragmenting in real time, each assumption he had built his superiority upon crumbling like sand. Marcus looked at him with something approaching pity. "I'm a janitor, Mr. Hayes," he said calmly. "I do clean floors and empty trash cans. Honest work that pays my bills and supports my daughter. But that doesn't define my intelligence, my worth, or my right to basic human dignity." Victoria Chin stepped closer to Derek, her presence suddenly intimidating in a way it had never been before. She handed the business card back to Marcus with a respectful nod. "Mr. Williams," she said formally, "I believe we need to discuss your current employment situation." "And Mr. Hayes," she continued, turning her attention to the pale manager, "I think we need to have a very serious conversation about your management style and its impact on this organization." Derek's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The junior executives who had laughed at his earlier jokes now looked at him with barely concealed disgust, their loyalty evaporating as quickly as his authority had collapsed. "You see," Victoria continued, her voice cutting through the lobby like a blade, "I've been observing the dynamics in this building for quite some time. Your treatment of Mr. Williams has been not only unprofessional, but potentially actionable under our harassment policies." The security guards who had flanked Derek earlier now seemed to be positioning themselves closer to him, but not as allies. Their stance suggested they were prepared to escort him from the building if necessary, their earlier discomfort with his behavior now making perfect sense. Victoria Chen's revelation that she had been observing sent another shock wave through the gathered crowd. Derek's face had gone ashen as he realized the depth of his miscalculation, but his desperation drove him to one final, catastrophic gambit. "Wait just a minute," Derek said, his voice cracking with panic. "You can't just take his word for this. Anyone can carry around an old business card. How do we know he's telling the truth about his background or qualifications?" Victoria raised an eyebrow at Derek's audacity, but Marcus stepped forward before she could respond. "You want proof of my qualifications, Mr. Hayes," he said quietly. "Very well. Let me ask you about the Meridian account restructuring project that's been stalled on the 23rd floor for the past 6 months. Derek's eyes widened in surprise. That information was supposed to be confidential, restricted to senior management only. "How could you possibly know about that?" he demanded, his voice rising with a mixture of fear and confusion. Marcus smiled for the first time that evening, expression that transformed his entire demeanor from submissive janitor to confident executive. "Because I've been watching you struggle with a basic portfolio diversification strategy that any first-year MBA student could solve in their sleep," he replied calmly. The watching executives exchanged meaningful glances, several of them nodding in recognition. The Meridian project had indeed been a source of ongoing frustration, with Derek's team failing repeatedly to find a workable solution. "Your fundamental error," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the authoritative tone of a seasoned consultant, "is treating the portfolio as discrete assets rather than understanding the interconnected risk relationships. You're trying to optimize individual components instead of optimizing the system as a whole." Derek's mouth fell open as Marcus outlined the exact problems that had plagued his team for months, problems he had never shared with anyone outside his immediate circle. The climactic moment had arrived as Marcus continued his brilliant analysis, his voice carrying the confident authority of his former executive self. "The solution requires a 3-phase rebalancing approach," he explained, addressing the assembled crowd as if they were his boardroom colleagues. "Phase 1 involves consolidating the underperforming Asian markets exposure. Phase 2 restructures the technology sector allocations to hedge against volatility. And Phase 3 implements a dynamic hedging strategy using derivatives to protect against currency fluctuations." Derek stood speechless, his face cycling through expressions of shock, humiliation, and growing terror as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. The junior executives who had witnessed his earlier cruelty now looked at him with open contempt, recognizing that they had been complicit in the systematic harassment of someone far more qualified than their supposed superior. Victoria Chen stepped forward, her decision clearly made. "Mr. Williams," she said formally, "I am Victoria Chen, owner and CEO of Chen Holdings, which owns this building and employs Mr. Hayes through our subsidiary management company. I have been observing the workplace culture here for several months, and what I have witnessed tonight represents the culmination of behavior that is both morally reprehensible and legally actionable." Derek's knees seemed to buckle as the full implications hit him. The woman he had barely noticed, whose presence he had dismissed as irrelevant, was actually his ultimate boss. His career, his reputation, his future, all crumbling in the space of a few devastating minutes. "Mr. Hayes," Victoria continued, her voice carrying the finality of a judge delivering sentence, "your employment with any Chun Holdings subsidiary is terminated immediately. Security will escort you from the building, and you can expect to hear from our legal department regarding potential harassment and discrimination claims. The security guards moved forward, their earlier reluctance replaced by grim satisfaction as they flanked Derek. His mouth opened and closed wordlessly, any protest dying in his throat as he faced the consequences of his prejudice and cruelty. 3 weeks later, Marcus Williams sat in the executive conference room on the 30th floor of Meridian Tower, reviewing the final details of the restructured Meridian portfolio with Victoria Chun and her senior team. His custom-tailored suit felt strange after years of janitor uniforms, but his confidence had returned like muscle memory, each strategic recommendation flowing naturally from expertise that had never truly disappeared. The Meridian project had been completed ahead of schedule and under budget, saving Chun Holdings millions in potential losses while positioning them for aggressive growth in emerging markets. Victoria had offered Marcus a permanent consulting position with equity participation, recognizing that talent and character mattered far more than recent job titles or temporary circumstances. Derek Hayes had left the building that night in disgrace, his termination becoming corporate legend within days. His replacement, a young woman with exceptional credentials and genuine respect for her team, had personally apologized to Marcus on behalf of the management structure that had failed him so completely. At home that evening, Marcus helped 80-year-old Sophia with her science project, her bright eyes shining with pride as she told her classmates that her daddy was now a business consultant who helped companies solve complicated problems. She had never needed to know about his struggles or sacrifices, only that her father loved her enough to endure anything for her future. The janitor position had been filled by someone else, but Marcus still nodded respectfully to the night cleaning staff when he worked late hours. He understood better than most that dignity lived in the heart, not the title, and that every honest worker deserved recognition for their contribution to the world. If this story of hidden worth and ultimate recognition touched your heart, please drop a comment and let us know your favorite part, character, or if you've witnessed similar situations where someone's true abilities were overlooked because of assumptions about their background. Sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to see their real value.